We come now to a new day, of course, and today we're going to be focusing on the latter portion of the type that runs from Joshua chapter 1 to Joshua chapter 12. And our subject this morning in this session is Joshua 10, one of the most remarkable chapters in the Word of God. It's a beacon chapter, is Joshua chapter 10. I want to demonstrate that to you this morning. It's a beacon chapter because it casts so much light on what is to come in the scriptures of truth. This is one of those chapters where the framework of prophecy, here in the form of a type, flows off into the rest of the scriptures, and especially into the apocalypse, as you're going to see here this morning. So Joshua 10, what do we find in it? Well, Joshua 6, of course, was the Armageddon chapter that we considered yesterday, sets forth Armageddon in great clarity. Joshua 7 and 8 dealt with Israel's redemption. Joshua 9, of course, was the submission of some nations to Christ after Armageddon. So what would come then, do you think, after that, in the framework of prophecy? Well, of course, the rebellion of the Catholic nations against the rule of Christ. We had a look at Psalm 2, did we not? So while nations who submit will be put to work building the temple, the Catholic nations, particularly those of Europe, will unite behind the Pope to rebel against Christ. They will call him, of course, the Antichrist, implementing their doctrine of Antichrist. So Joshua chapter 10 covers the 40-year period beyond Armageddon that leads to the destruction of Babylon the Great. It is a wonderful chapter. It's a unique chapter. You know why it's unique? Because it records a unique day, a day that was extended. And we're going to see that refers to that 40-year period of divine judgment, a day in which we are going to be very much involved very soon, brothers and sisters. So we can look forward to these things. And we're going to see with great clarity the things that will be accomplished by Christ and the saints when they destroy the enemy of our God, Babylon the Great. So who do we meet then in verse 1 of Joshua 10? Well, we meet the king of Jerusalem. Look at him here in verse 1. Now it came to pass when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, had heard how Joshua had taken Ai, and so it goes on. Now Adoni-Zedek means the Lord of righteousness, and he was the king of Jerusalem. Well, of course, we know who the first king of Jerusalem was. He's called the king of Salem in Genesis chapter 14. His name was Melchizedek. And you see, this man is saying, well, I actually come from Melchizedek. I think I know another man who sits in the Vatican who says he's the vicar of Christ on the earth. Don't you know him? Yeah, he's called the Pope. He claims to have his origins in Christ. Melchizedek, the great Melchizedek. Yes, no doubt this man thought he was a successor to Melchizedek of Genesis chapter 14. So he's the type of the real Antichrist, isn't he? Now, what do we mean by Antichrist? Well, you see, the Greek word anti is used in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 22. It's a useful reference to have, actually, because you see, we read there that Archelaus took over in the room of his father Herod. Now, the word room is what the King James Version chooses for this word anti. But it gives you the idea, because you see, the Antichrist is someone who replaces Christ. He's in the place of Christ. He's in the room of Christ. And that's exactly what the Pope claims to be. He's the vicar of Christ on the earth. And you know, he has a title. One of the titles of the papacy adopted during the Crusades was the King of Jerusalem. And you might know that the Pope today is calling for Jerusalem to become an international city. Yeah, because he wants it to be the Catholic city. He wants it to be his city. He wants to rule in Jerusalem. He still thinks he's the King of Jerusalem. A title claimed way back in the time of the Crusades. So when you meet Adoni-Zedek, King of Jerusalem, you have a type of the papacy. And we're going to see what he does here. And this, of course, because of the context, is clearly after the events of Armageddon. This is about the rebellion of the Catholic system against the rule of Christ post-Armageddon. Now it says in verse 1 that he heard how Yeshua, Jesus, had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it. Now Ai, of course, means a heap of ruins. And that's exactly what the world will be like. After Armageddon, the infrastructure of the world will just be a heap of ruins. But that's not going to stop them. It's not going to stop them, is it? They're going to carry on in their rebellion. And so verse 1 goes on to say this, that as he had done to Jericho and her king, so he had done to Ai and her king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them. Now we pointed out, of course, that the Gibeonites are a type of the latter-day Tarshish powers led by Britain. Well, it's interesting, we're going to read about this in verse 2 in a minute, and we'll see a very interesting little fact about the Gibeonites. Now what this is suggesting, of course, is that when Britain and other nations submit to Christ, it's going to upset the Pope very greatly. And he's not going to just sit there and do nothing. He's going to actually attack these people. He's going to say that they're now his enemies because they've submitted to Christ. It's exactly what happens here. In Joshua chapter 10, it says they were among them. It's a reference to the submissive nations who have been required to commit to Christ when they've come to him. Initially, of course, with deceit in their heart, but he sorted them out. Verse 2 says that they feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, as one of the royal cities. Now we read Psalm 2 yesterday, verses 1 to 3, that they gathered themselves together. They fear greatly the claims of this one who has set himself up in Jerusalem as king, sitting upon the throne of David, and they want to get rid of him. They are going to challenge him. They fear greatly. And of course they saw Gibeon submit, and it's described as one of the royal cities. And the word in the Hebrew, mamlakah, means a kingdom or a dominion, just like Britain is a kingdom and a dominion, isn't it? So you see how clear this is? You see how pristine the type is? Point after point shows that this is meant to be read, brothers and sisters, as a type of the things in which we are going to be involved very shortly. Let's come down into verse 5, because this is what they do. They gathered this great confederacy. Verse 5, therefore the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon, gathered themselves together and went up, they and all their hosts, and encamped before Gibeon and made war against it. So they attack the nations who have submitted to Christ. There's no doubt that that's going to happen because the pattern is set here in the prophecy of Joshua. So why is there a confederacy of 5 kings, do you think? Well, 5's the number of grace, is it not? So this is about religious issues. This is a confederacy of nations who present themselves as being the paragons of religious virtue, who are claiming that that man in Jerusalem who says he's the king of the Jews is an imposter. Here I am, says the Pope. I'm the one that's right in this. So he gathers nations together with him who support his claims to be the religious arbiter of the world. Got a picture? So that's why 5 is there. But guess what, brothers and sisters? If you just set aside the king of Jerusalem because he's the leader of this confederacy, guess how many other nations are listed in Joshua 10? 10. Because you see, from verse 28 of Joshua 10 to the end of the chapter, you will find 7 cities that were overthrown who were supporting this confederacy against Christ, against Joshua in this case. You see, but you can add to that the king of Jarmuth. He's mentioned in verse 5. You can add to that Jericho and Ai. So when you add to the 7 from verse 28 onwards, Jarmuth, Jericho and Ai, you have 10. Now isn't that interesting? Because there are 10 toes on Nebuchadnezzar's image. There are 10 horns on the beast of Revelation chapter 17. And we are told who they are. These are 10 kings who have received no power as yet, but received power 1 hour with the beast. That's what this chapter is about, prophetically. It's setting forth that fact. And again, the detail is just overwhelming. You know it's right, because it conforms absolutely with what we know about the framework of Bible prophecy. So let's just have a look at this chart then that we've seen before. Christ has been in the earth for 10 years prior to Armageddon. He's prepared the saints for their work. And we see the Catholic system, this is about the pattern of Roman Catholic resistance to Christ for 40 years after Armageddon. We see the pattern. They suffer a heavy blow from Armageddon, but they rebuild in that 10 years between Armageddon and the actual destruction of Rome itself. Then they rebuild again in Central Europe. This is the time when Elijah has the second exodus of Israel underway, and Israel is used as the weapon against the papal system until finally, in 2060, the Pope is destroyed, along with the supporting powers. And then there's a period, if Christ comes this year, there's a period of 7 years of cleaning up the remaining Catholics, by the way, brothers and sisters. 7 years already, because we've got a fixed date, and that date is 2060, when the papacy must be destroyed. Even Isaac Newton understood that, all right? He knew it was going to be 2060. He's got it in his Bible. So that is a fixed date. What we don't know is when Christ will return. But if it happens to be this year, and let's hope it is this year, then there will be a clean-up of 7 years. And that will fulfil Revelation 19 and verse 21, by the way. But that's another subject. Let's come back to Joshua chapter 10. In verse 6 we read this. And the men of Gibeon sent unto Joshua to the camp to Gilgal, saying, Slack not thy hand from thy servant. So they make an appeal. They make an appeal, and they say, it goes on to say, For all the kings of the Amorites that dwell in the mountains are gathered together against us. Now, of course, we found out, didn't we, yesterday, that Amorites means assayer, in the sense of publicising something or being prominent. And this obviously refers to the call of the papacy for support. Support against Christ, support against those nations who have submitted to him. And then we come down to the record, and I've got to move through this fairly quickly because there's a lot of stuff here this morning. Let's come down to verse 10, because we know what happens. Joshua delivers the Gibeonites, and in verse 10 we read, And Yahweh discomfited them before Israel, and slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and chased them along the way that goeth up to Beth Horon, and smote them to Azekah and to Makkedah. Now I want you to just, if you can keep your hand in Joshua 10, I want you to come across to Isaiah chapter 28. I want to show you how this flows off into the rest of the scriptures. In Isaiah 28. Now, by the way, Isaiah 28 is a chapter that deals with our judgment. In verses 16 and 17, it's our appearance at the judgment seat. If you have a look at verse 17, you'll see it talks about, I will lay judgment also will I lay to the line, and righteousness to the plummet, and the hail, I'm going to talk about hail in a minute, and the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters shall overflow the hiding place. This is where Christ is quoting from when he says at the end of his discourse on the mount, remember, in Matthew 7, about the man who builds his house upon the rock, and the other man who builds his house upon the sand. And what happened? The rains came, and the floods descended, and it proved what foundation was there. If the foundation was rock, it stayed. Well, verse 16 of this chapter talks about the rock, the foundation upon which we should build, about the cornerstone, the building stone of Yahweh's house. If we got our structure built on that, brothers and sisters, and on his teaching, the judgment seat will not overthrow us. But if our foundation is upon sand, then the flood of waters will sweep that foundation away, and that will be the end for us. Now that's the context, okay? We know what the context is. Our judgment precedes the judgment of the world. So come down to Isaiah 28 verse 21. For Yahweh shall rise up as in Mount Perazim, he shall be wroth as in the valley of Gibeon. I wonder what that's a reference to. He shall be wroth as in the valley of Gibeon. Yeah, it's a reference to Joshua chapter 10 and verse 10. And it goes on to say this, that he may do his work, his strange work, and begin and bring to pass his act, his strange act. God doesn't want to destroy, brothers and sisters. He would that all men might be saved. But the purpose of the extended day is to sweep the wicked away so he can start again. It's a strange act in that sense. He doesn't want to do this. I mean, that's not his desire, but he has to do it, that his righteousness might be upheld. That's why it's called a strange act. So it's a short period of time. It goes on to say in verse 22, Now therefore be ye not mockers. Mockers? Yeah, that's what the papacy's going to be, isn't it? Mocking his claim to be king of the Jews. Lest your hands be made strong, for I have heard from Adonai Yahweh of armies, it's a reference to you and me in the act of judgment, a consumption, even determined upon the whole earth. That's why we know this is about Armageddon. It's upon the whole earth. You see, so this is the events of Armageddon and the 40 years that follow, to sweep aside the refuge of lies. Now, just by the way, if you want to make notes about this, you want to make a note that Paul quotes from verse 22 of Isaiah 28 in Romans chapter 9 and verse 28. And if you go to Romans 9, guess what it's about? It's about the redemption of the Jews, all of which is part and parcel of the overthrow of Babylon the Great. As we saw yesterday, the redemption of the Jews is part and parcel of the work that Christ will do through Elijah and the saints. Got it? So you see how far-reaching this is? It runs off into the rest of the scripture. We have reference back here to Joshua 10. No wonder. This is the most unique day in history when God stops the order of nature. He causes the sun to stand still in the valley of Ajalon. Think about that. And what does he do? I don't know. Does he bend the light? Does he stop the earth from... I don't know. But how would you do that? There's no day like that, we are told. Yeah, so it's unique. Little wonder that this chapter is a beacon chapter when it comes to Bible prophecy. It speaks of the overthrow of those who revolt against the rule of Christ in that day. And even the name suggests that. Beth Horon, this is where they're destroyed. Beth Horon means the house of hollowness. And their rebellion against Christ will prove to be hollow. Azekah means to be dug over, so they're ploughed up. And Makkedah means the place of shepherds, the false shepherds, who are revealed for what they are, because they will, of course, have claimed to be, like the Pope, the vicar of Christ on the earth. So let's come to verse 11. And it says this, "And it came to pass, as they fled from before Israel, and were in the going down to Beth Horon, that Yahweh cast down great stones from heaven upon them unto Azekah, and they died. They were more which died with hailstones than they whom the children of Israel slew with the sword." Now, these hailstones, there's two Hebrew words here, barad, 29 occurrences in the Old Testament, and eben, stone, particularly a building stone. But these hailstones were, of course, designed to destroy. And they destroyed selectively. Because you just get a picture in your mind. You've got Israel out there and they're fighting. They're fighting against these Canaanites, and all of a sudden, boing, a hailstone comes in and hits the Canaanite. Doesn't hit the Israelite, does it? How do you do this? Dropping hailstones, hitting the Canaanites, but not the Israelites. Well, that's how God makes his judgments, and he will make the same judgment in the future, brothers and sisters. It will be selective. He will select people to be removed. He will remove them and leave those that you can do something with. That's the principle here. And we're going to have a look in a minute at Revelation 16 verse 21, because this is where it involves you and me. We are, in fact, the hailstones of the future. The literal hailstones that occurred in the days of Joshua are going to have an equivalent in the latter days, and you and I are going to be those hailstones. So this is why the word Eben is there, because that's actually got to do with the building of a house. Eben, the family builder. So these judgments are designed to build. They've got to remove the wicked first. It says it slew them. It means to smite with deadly intent, that Hebrew word. These hailstones slew them. Now, what about hail in the day of judgment? Well, the word hail occurs 4 times in the Apocalypse. That's the Greek word, chalaza. 4 times in the Apocalypse. In Psalm 148 verse 8, hail is listed among the other elements that fulfill Yahweh's word. There are 17 occurrences of hail in Exodus 9 and 10 which deal with the plagues upon Egypt. In Isaiah 28 verses 2 and 17 we saw reference to it, didn't we? Hail is used in the context of divine judgment. Hail will be used as a weapon in the divine judgments on the nations. We know that from Job 38. This is 22 and 23 where it says, "Have you seen, have you explored the treasures of the hail and the snow, says God, that I have reserved against the day of judgment?" You haven't seen anything yet. You've seen nothing yet. That's what he's saying. In Psalm 18 verses 12 and 13, hail is used twice in the context of Armageddon. And in Isaiah 32 verse 19, hail is used in the context of judgment on Rome. There's no question about hail being an important element. So there will be literal hailstones in the future, especially in Armageddon, but it will be the spiritual hailstones that will do the work against Babylon the Great. Now this is how hail is formed. Hail is a form of precipitation consisting of roughly spherical pellets of ice and snow, usually combined in alternating layers. The true hailstones occur only at the beginning of thunderstorms. That's why you see it comes at the beginning of the divine judgments. And never when the ground temperature is below freezing. Raindrops or snow pellets formed in cumulonimbus clouds are swept vertically in the turbulent air currents characteristic of thunderstorms. The hailstone grows by the repeated collisions of these particles with supercooled water, that is, water that is colder than its freezing point, yet remains in liquid form. This water is suspended in the cloud through which the particle is travelling. When the particles of hail become too heavy to be supported by the air currents, they fall to the earth. Now that's actually a description of what's going to happen to you and me very shortly. All right? I want you to come and have a look with me at Revelation chapter 16. Because this is where we're referred to in this context, brothers and sisters. Revelation 16, of course, from verse 17 onwards, is about the pouring out of the seventh vial of the wrath of God. So who's it poured out against? Verse 19 tells us, Revelation 16 and verse 19. It says, "And the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath." Then read verse 21. Who does the damage here? "And there fell upon men a great hail out of heaven, every stone about the weight of a talent. And men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail. For the plague thereof was exceeding great." Now we know, of course, that the Apocalypse is a book of symbols. This is not about literal hailstones here. You want literal hailstones, you go back to Ezekiel 38. All right? They're going to be used at Armageddon. This is not literal hailstones. This is spiritual hailstones. And of course we know how hailstones are formed by this rapid uprush of moist air into cooler air, just like the saints who will be taken, as it were, upwards by nature. They will be changed. They're going to go, as it were, towards heaven in that sense. They're going to take on the nature of God at the time of their immortalisation. Symbolises the formation of the saints as the weapons of heaven. And that's why Revelation 16:21 is so important. This is drawn from Joshua chapter 10, verses 8 to 14. Now, let's think about this. What does it say here in verse 21 of Revelation 16? It says that the weight of these hailstones was about a talent. Now, it's thought to be something in excess of 100 pounds. I'm going to use American terminology. If I was doing this in Australia or Canada, I would say 45 kilograms. Okay? Now, most of you, of course, I'm looking here at, we used Canaan for this at Houston once. He probably remembers that, being out the front, Brother Canaan. Yeah, and I asked him what he weighed. I can't remember what it was, but let's just say it's around 200 pounds. All right? Most people are somewhere between 200 and 240. Okay? Most men, I would say. Most ladies, of course, are a bit less than that. But just think about it. When you're made immortal, what don't you need that you now have in your mortal body? Blood. You don't need 9 pints of blood. You don't need a heart to pump it around. You don't need lungs to breathe. You don't need kidneys or a liver or 2 miles of stomach, all right? None of that. And a lot of other things too. You don't need generative organs. That's all gone, all right? Take that away, guess how much you're going to weigh? A 230-pound man will come back to around 100 pounds. Yeah. This is talking about being made immortal, brothers and sisters. And when our nature is changed, it's like the formation of hailstones, isn't it? A rapid uprush, instantaneous change to be brought to the nature of Almighty God himself. And the very first thing that we will do is to descend down upon the nations of this world in judgment. That's what these hailstones represent here. Okay? So that's the prospect of the future. When we read Joshua 10, we should be reading it that way. Because we are here in Joshua 10 as the instruments, the weapons of divine judgment against Babylon the Great, this awful confederacy. So here we've got the talent, about 100 pounds or 45 kilogram, the approximate weight of an immortal minus the vital organs and the blood. What a wonderful prospect that is, to become hailstones in the divine plan and purpose. So coming back to Joshua chapter 10. And in verse 12 we meet these words. You should notice these words. "Then spake Joshua to Yahweh in the day." All right, now this is important. In the day, we're going to see this repeated in another part of Scripture. It goes on to say, when Yahweh delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand thou still. Now this is totally unique in history. That's why it says in verse 14, and there was no day like that before it or after it, that Yahweh hearkened unto the voice of a man. For Yahweh fought for Israel. So the sun stands still. Now in the Hebrew, by the way, that word stood still is damam. It means to be dumb or silent or still. So the sun, which would normally inexorably pass through the sky, I mean, you can't stop it, can you? Our whole life is governed by it. But on this day, it stood still for a whole day. So there's an extended day here. And this is going to point to something very important. See, it's written in the book of Jasher. It says, is not this written in the book of Jasher? Now, why that phrase there? Well, Jasher just means to happen to mean straight or upright. So that Rotherham and Young's translate it that way. In the book of the upright, because it is for the upright. It is for those people who will become the hailstones of the future. That's why it's here for them. He goes on to say this. It says at the end of verse 13, so the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and hasted not to go down about a whole day. So this is an extended day. It's the day of Yahweh. Can I take you to Zechariah chapter 14? Now you'll all know that Zechariah 12 to 14 are all about the same subject. They're about Armageddon and the 40 years that follow Armageddon to establish the kingdom. Now just a little bit of proof on that. Zechariah 12, if you have a look at verse 2, Jerusalem's made a cup of trembling unto all nations round about. When's this going to happen? When they shall be in the siege both against Judah and against Jerusalem. That's still to come. That's Armageddon, okay? But have a look at the end of Zechariah 14. Have a look at what it says in verse 21, the last verse of the prophecy. Yea, every pot in Jerusalem and in Judah shall be holiness to Yahweh of hosts. The temple is there. It's talking about the temple. Verse 20, the temple's complete and in service. Well, that's not going to happen until 40 years after Armageddon. So you see, from Zechariah 12, the first two verses, to the end of chapter 14, is about 40 years. But what is the repeated word here? The repeated word is the day of Yahweh. And 23 times between verse 1 of Zechariah 12 and verse 21 of Zechariah 14, you will find that phrase, the day, the day, the day. Why? It's not a normal day, is it? It's an extended day, of which the extended day of Joshua chapter 10 is a type. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know it because if you have a look at Zechariah 14 and verse 3, it says this. Then shall Yahweh go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. What day of battle? Well, the one in Joshua chapter 10. There was no day like that. Proof? Have a look at Joshua 10. Come to Joshua 10 and verse 42. It says this, Joshua 10:42. And all these kings and their land did Joshua take at one time, because Yahweh, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. This is what's picked up in Zechariah 14 verse 3. You see, we are being told by the Spirit, you must interpret Joshua chapter 10 as being the extended day from Armageddon to the establishment of the temple and its opening for service. That is the day, right? You can't get any better proof than that when God quotes himself, okay? You can't argue against that when God quotes himself. And he is quoting in Zechariah 14 from Joshua chapter 10. So we know that this type is there and it's meant to be read that way. So what happens back here? The sun stood still about a whole day. And the two words that are used there in the Hebrew are tamim yomi. Yomi, of course, is a day. Young's Literal says, as a perfect day. Isn't that interesting? As a perfect day. And it will be a perfect day because it's going to culminate in the kingdom of God being established. This is the most important time in human history when Christ will destroy the enemies of Yahweh his God, establish the kingdom, build and open the temple for service so that all men might come to the truth and that you and I might have 1,000 years of labour to bring as many as possible to share eternal life with us. Where did this happen? Well, it happened in the valley of Ajalon, the field of the deer. The fruitful valley of Ajalon is 14 or so miles northwest of Jerusalem. I've been there a couple of times. Fabulous place. You know what? It looks like it looked in the days of Joshua. They haven't allowed city building. It's still farming land. You can stand up and look over the valley of Ajalon. And I can tell you, truthfully, when I stand there and look over that valley, the hairs on the back of my neck, I don't have many on my head, but I've got them on the back of my neck, okay? The hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shiver. I think of that day when the sun stood still above the valley of Ajalon. It did not move. What a unique day that is. And it all points forward, brothers and sisters, to the day that's about to come in which you and I are going to be involved. That day of Yahweh, of Zechariah 12 to 14, where Yahweh fought for Israel. The type is clear, is it not? So where does this culminate? In Joshua 10. In Joshua 10, we come to verse 16. He destroys, with the use of the hailstones, the confederacy of grace that has arraigned against him. He returns to the camp in verse 15. But where do these kings go? Verse 16. But these 5 kings fled and hid themselves in a cave at Makkedah. And that word simply means a cave or a den or a hole. You know, it does actually say in Isaiah, doesn't it, that they will resort to the caves and the dens of the earth. But this is not about that, okay? Catholicism, at the time of Armageddon, is said to ascend out of the abyss, all right? They come out of the abyss because that's their home. Yeah. Makkedah means the place of shepherds because they're going to be proven to be false shepherds. Come down to verse 19. Stay ye not, pursue after your enemies, he says, and smite the hindmost of them. Suffer them not to enter into their cities, for Yahweh your God hath delivered them into your hand. There will be no place for refuge for those who support the papacy against Christ. They're going to be destroyed, brothers and sisters. They will have been given several opportunities to turn their back on the Pope, but they will insist on supporting him against Christ, and they therefore seal their doom. There's no hope for them. They're going to be destroyed and their land vacated, we find in the other prophecies like Isaiah 34. It says in verse 20, And it came to pass when Joshua and the children of Israel had made an end of slaying them with a very great slaughter till they were consumed, that the rest which remained of them entered into fenced cities. Yep, that's the remnant that I spoke about a little earlier, Revelation chapter 19 verse 21. Because there's going to be a clean-up period of those who supported the Pope against Christ. We come to verse 20. It says, None moved his tongue. Might be verse 21 actually. None moved his tongue against any of the children of Israel. And of course we know that the Amorites, the Sayers who supported the Pope, listening to his mouth, now they are silenced. None moved his tongue. Come to verse 24. And it came to pass when they brought out those kings unto Joshua from their cave, that Joshua called for all the men of Israel and said to the captains of the men of war which went with him, that is a reference to the saints who will be with Christ, Come near, put your feet upon the necks of these kings. And they came near and put their feet upon the necks of them. You know what Paul says in Romans chapter 16 and verse 20? He says, God shall bruise Satan under your feet shortly. That's prefigured here. Put your feet on the necks of these men. God will bruise Satan under your feet shortly. You know what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 verses 25 to 27? He has put all things under his feet. Begins the crushing of Catholicism. Goes on for the next 1,000 years. What do they do with these kings? Verse 26. And afterward Joshua smote them and slew them and hanged them on 5 trees. They were crucified. He crucifies them. And they were hanging upon the trees until the evening. Until the evening? Yes. And look at verse 27. And it came to pass at the time of the going down of the sun that Joshua commanded, and they took them down off the trees and cast them into the cave wherein they had been hid, and laid great stones in the cave's mouth, which remain until this very day. I want you to come again if you can. Just keep your hand in Joshua 10. Come back to Zechariah 14 briefly with me. Zechariah chapter 14. We'll have a look at verses 6 and 7. Brother Thomas explains this beautifully in his writings. In Zechariah 14 verses 6 and 7 we read this. Verse 6. Now we know what the earlier verses of Zechariah 14 are about. We've had the extended day. This is where these judgments are played out. We've got the events of Armageddon referred to in verses 4 and 5. And then we've got, of course, the events that follow that. Where's it heading? Look at verse 6. And it shall come to pass in that day, we're talking about the extended day, that the light shall not be clear nor dark, but it shall be one day which shall be known to Yahweh, not day nor night. This is mysterious language, isn't it? But it shall come to pass that at the evening time it shall be light. Now you remember we made reference to the evening in Joshua 10 verse 27? And when it says it came to pass at the time of the going down of the sun that this confederacy that support the papacy are shown for what they are, and they're locked away in the abyss. Yep, this is what this is referring to. Now let me give you Brother Thomas's translation of Zechariah 14 verses 6 and 7. This is what he says. And it shall be in that day there shall not be brightness, the splendid ones drawing in. And it shall be one day that shall be made known by Yahweh, neither a day nor a night. But it shall be at the time of the evening there shall be brightness. You know what that means? It means, brothers and sisters, that the glory of the saints who will be the hailstones, the saints who will do the work of judgment, their glory, their relationship to Christ will not be revealed. It will be obscured because they'll be in the work of judgment. But when they have completed the task of destroying Babylon the Great, at least its leadership, then Christ will reveal their glory to the world. It'll be at the evening time. It'll be at the end of the 40-year judgment period. Okay? This extended day at the evening time, towards the end. That's why we pointed out yesterday that the marriage supper of the Lamb comes towards the end of the 40-year period of judgment. It's not until he has shown the false system, the harlot system, who claims to be his bride, it won't be until he shows the world what they truly are that he will reveal his bride, his true bride, to the world. And it'll be at the evening time, towards the end of that 40-year period of divine judgments. How wonderfully that accords with Joshua chapter 10, eh? Yeah, because it's at the evening time when they put these men, these 5 kings, into the abyss, which is where the papacy and his supporters are going. Then, when Christ has revealed them for what they truly are, he will say to those nations who have submitted to him, and this is the story of Revelation 19, isn't it? The unclean birds of Revelation 19, the nations who have submitted to him, he will say to them, come up to the great feast, the supper, right? And I want to reveal to you my bride. That's what will happen, brothers and sisters. What a glorious day that will be. So they cast them into a cave, and the old serpent, political manifestation in Rome and the papacy, is cast into the abyss. I don't need to take you to Revelation 18 verse 21 or 19 verse 20. Or 20 verse 3, because it says in each of those places that they end up in the abyss. Verses 28 to 39 of Joshua 10 show us 7 cities that are overthrown. Now this is interesting. Just let's pick these up. In my Bible I've got them highlighted because I want them to stand off the page. Verse 28. And that day, Joshua... Did you notice what it said? It said, at that day. What day? Well, during the 40-year period extended day. That's what it's talking about. At that day. It is so precise. At that day, Joshua took Makkedah. Verse 29. Then Joshua passed from Makkedah and all Israel with him unto Libnah and fought against Libnah. Look at verse 31. And Joshua passed from Libnah and all Israel with him unto Lachish and encamped against it and fought against it. Look at verse 33. Then Horam, king of Gezer, came up to help them, and he's destroyed. Look at verse 34. And from Lachish Joshua passed unto Eglon and destroys them. Verse 36. Joshua went up from Eglon and all Israel with him unto Hebron, and they fought against it. And verse 38. And Joshua returned all Israel with him to Debir, and they fought against it. There are 7 cities. And it represents in type the 7 campaigns of Christ. Just like Joshua had 7 campaigns to subdue the land. Just like in the reign of David, he had 7 campaigns to subdue the nations round about. This is the 7 thunder judgments of Revelation chapter 10. Okay? So how clear is that, you think? It's just remarkable what we have here in the record of Joshua chapter 10. And then we come to verse 40. And it says this. So Joshua smote all the country of the hills, and of the south, and of the vale, and of the springs, and all their kings. He left none remaining. He cleans up the lot. But utterly destroyed all that breathed, as Yahweh God of Israel commanded. He smote them from Kadesh Barnea even unto Gaza, and all the country of Goshen even unto Gibeon. He leaves none of their kings remaining. So Christ will subdue all the rulers of this world in that 40-year period of conquest, the extended day of Zechariah chapters 12 to 14. Kadesh Barnea is mentioned. It means the sanctuary of the wandering sun. What is the ultimate sanctuary of the wandering sun? God's firstborn name. What is their ultimate sanctuary? Well, Zion. That's where we go. That's the ultimate sanctuary, isn't it? Of the wandering sun. Yep. Verse 42. It says this, and all these kings and their land did Joshua take at one time. There's your confirmation. It's in the extended day. It's at one time. One day. He took all of these kings at one time because Yahweh God of Israel fought for Israel. Quoted as we found in Zechariah 14 and verse 3. So by the end of 40 years, Christ will have conquered all rulers and captured all lands. He will have complete control. Now, brothers and sisters, I want you to notice something. Because we're told in verse 43 that Joshua returned and all Israel with him unto the camp to Gilgal. Just like Christ and the saints will return to Zion in the evening time, of which we read in Zechariah 14 and verse 7. Did you know that there's just one more conflict to go in the book of Joshua? And that conflict will be the subject of our next talk in the exhortation. It is the conflict at the end of the 1,000 years. Yeah. It's all there, brothers and sisters, as we will see. Gilgal is mentioned here. They went to the camp to Gilgal, which we saw in our studies, means rolling. It takes us back to the time of the immortalisation of the saints. This is the place that memorialised the cutting off of mortality. Okay? Life forevermore is commanded in Zion. Remember that? Yeah. And there is a break now until the final conflict of the book of Joshua. We're going to have a look at that in our next session, where the old serpent is destroyed and Israel is seen as the great nation that God promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12.